Hi, welcome to Refugee Part 12. This is read with permission from Scholastic Books. Fix my screen. All right, so we're going to start out with Joseph. So Joseph is just outside of Havana Harbor in 1939. He's 19 days away from home. And as you probably recall, his father jumped overboard and had to be rescued by a Cuban policeman and then was brought to shore. And Joseph felt like his whole life was falling apart. His mom had taken that sleeping drought and couldn't wake up, and his dad was gone, and now they probably can't get into Cuba. Joseph wished he was invisible. Once the rest of the passengers discovered who had jumped overboard yesterday, everyone stopped to tell him how sorry they were, how everything would be all right. How could it be all right? How would it ever be all right? Joseph stood at the rail on A deck where his father had jumped. Down below, the sea was no longer empty. It was dotted with little motorboats and rowboats. Some carried reporters shouting up questions and trying to get pictures of the ship. Other boats offered up bunches of fresh bananas and bags of coconuts and oranges. Passengers on C deck tossed money down, and the fruit was passed up the ladder by the Cuban policemen guarding the top and the bottom. Lately, though, the boats were full of relatives of people on board, mostly men. They had come ahead to Cuba to get jobs and find places for their families to live. One man brought the same little white dog every day and held it up for his wife to wave to. The boats with relatives came close enough for their families to yell back and forth a little, but they couldn't get any closer. Thanks to Joseph's father, a handful of Cuban police boats now surrounded the St. Louis. They kept the rescue ships at a distance and watched for anyone else who tried to jump to freedom or death. At night, the Cuban police boats swept the hull with searchlights, and the St. Louis's crew members, on the captain's orders, patrolled the decks on suicide watch. Evelyn, there he is. There's Papa, Renata cried. She stood a few paces away from Joseph down on the rail, trying to point out one of the little rowboats to her sister. Where? I don't see him, Evelyn whined. Joseph was more interested in the small police boat that had navigated its way through the flotilla and was pulling up to the St. Louis. Anytime they had a visitor now, it was cause for conversation, and soon word spread throughout the ship that the boat had brought the Cuban policeman who had saved Joseph's father. Joseph ran down to fetch his mother and sister, and together they hurried to the social hall, where a group of passengers and crew gathered to give the Cuban policeman a hero's welcome. They parted for the policeman, cheering and slapping him on the back and shaking hands with him as he went. It was the first time he had been back to the ship since jumping overboard to save Joseph's father, and Joseph and his family strained to get a good look at him over the heads of the other passengers. Joseph's mother cried and put a hand over her mouth, and Joseph felt a surge of affection for the policeman. This was the man who had saved his father's life. The policeman seemed genuinely flattered and surprised by all the attention. He was a short, stocky man with olive skin and a wide face and a thick mustache. He wore blue pants, a gray shirt with epaulets on the shoulders, and a matching gray beret. Around his waist was a leather belt with a nightstick and a holster hanging from it. His name, they were told, was Mariano Padron. Captain Schroeder arrived to thank Officer Padron on behalf of the passengers and crew. Joseph felt a ripple of tension spread throughout the room. Joseph had seen the captain less and less as the hot days of waiting at anchor dragged on, and he wasn't the only passenger who had noticed. But they were there to celebrate Officer Padron, not badger the captain about why they were still on the ship. The mood became happy again when the policeman was presented with a gift of 150 Reichsmarks that had been collected from grateful passengers. Officer Padron was stunned, and so was Joseph. 150 Reichsmarks was a lot of money, especially for people who might need that money later to pay for visas and entrance fees. Officer Padron tried to refuse the money, but the passengers wouldn't hear of it. I was just doing my job, Officer Padron told the audience through a translator, but I will never forget this. I will never forget any of you. Thank you. The passengers applauded again, and while many of them turned their attention to the captain to ask him for a status report, Joseph and his mother and sister pushed forward to talk to the policeman. Officer Padron's eyes lit up at the sight of Joseph's mother. He said something in Spanish, and the passenger who had spoken for him in front of the crowd smiled and translated his words. Senora, your father was a thief? Joseph's mother frowned. A thief? My father? No, I don't understand. Your father, he must be a thief, Officer Padron said through the translator, because he stole the stars from the sky and put them in the Senora's eyes. Joseph finally understood. It was some kind of compliment about how pretty she was. His mother smiled politely but impatiently. Officer Padron, what about my husband? She asked. Is he all right? They won't let me go ashore to see him. The policeman took off his hat. I'm so sorry. Very sorry. Senor Lendo? Yes, your husband is alive, he said through the interpreter. He's in the hospital. He has been... Officer Padron said something more, but the translator frowned. It was beyond his limited Spanish. Officer Padron could see the confusion and pantomimed what he meant by turning his wrists upside down, closing his eyes, and rolling his head back like he was asleep. Sedated, Mama said. There was pain in her voice, and Yosef knew she blamed herself. The whole reason her husband had gone was because she had been sedated and unable to stop him. Officer Padron nodded. It's not good, he said, but he will live. Yosef's mother took both the policeman's hand in her own and kissed them. Thank you, Officer Padron. She spoke in German, but the policeman seemed to understand. He blushed and nodded. Then he spied Ruthie half hidden behind her mother's skirt and knelt down to her. He put his policeman's beret on her head and said something in Spanish, and she smiled. He says, you're the policewoman now, the translator said. He will be the criminal. You must catch him. Officer Padron led Ruthie on a merry chase through the room, Ruthie squealing. Yosef's mother laughed through a sob. It was the first time Yosef had heard her laugh or seen her smile in months. Officer Padron let Ruthie catch him. He plucked the hat off Ruthie's head and put it on Yosef's head, speaking in Spanish again. He says it's your turn, the translator said. Oh, no, Yosef said. He waved a hand to make sure the policeman understood. He wasn't in the mood for fun and games. Besides, he was too old for that kind of thing. Officer Padron tapped Yosef's chest with the back of his hand, urging him to play. He says he is the passenger, the translator said. Officer Padron raised himself up in mock anger and spoke in Spanish. You, senor policeman, the translator said. When will we leave the ship? The happy mood suddenly disappeared. Yosef and his family and the translator all looked at each other awkwardly. Officer Padron had only meant to mimic what everyone was asking all the time, but the question made Yosef sad. It felt like they were never going to get off the ship. Officer Padron realized his mistake immediately, looked anguished for having brought it up. He nodded in sympathy, and then in unison he and Yosef spoke the answer all the Cuban guards always gave. Mañana, tomorrow. Now we are on to Isabel. She's somewhere between the Bahamas and Florida, 1994, 5 days away from home. So their boat is kind of falling apart. It's taking on a lot of water, so they come up with a plan where 2 people would slip into the ocean at a time to try to keep the boat from sinking. Isabel slipped over the side of the boat into the sea and sighed. The water was warm, but it felt much cooler than being in the boat. The sun was just setting on their western horizon, turning the world into a sepia-toned photograph, but it still had to be close to 100 degrees outside. It wouldn't have swamped their boat. If it wouldn't have swamped their boat and drowned them all for good, Isabel would have prayed for rain to break the muggy heat. Isabel's father had rigged up a makeshift sunshade out of his shirt for her mother. She seemed better now. The aspirin had kept Mommy's fever down, and though she was still exhausted and near to bursting with Isabel's baby brother, she seemed at peace somehow. Hot, but at peace. The rest of them wanted any relief, they had to wait for their turn in the water. Again, Isabel thought about their journey as a song. If the riots and trading for the gasoline were the first verse, the tanker and the storm the second verse, this part of their trip, the long, hot, stagnant day and a half they've been traveling from the Bahamas to Florida, this was the bridge. The third verse was different from the others. A third verse that was different from the others. This verse was death by slow measures. This was the down-tempo lull before the coming excitement of the climatic last verse in coda. This was limbo. They could do nothing but wait. The last sliver of the sun finally disappeared below the waves, and Luis cut the engine. The world went silent but for a soft lapping of water against the hull and the creak of their disintegrating boat. That's it, Luis said. With the sun down, we won't be able to navigate as well. Can we use the stars? Isabel asked. She remembered reading that sailors used to use the stars to navigate for centuries. Which one? Luis asked. None of them knew. Amara lifted one of the gasoline jugs and swished around what little was left in it. Saves us gas anyway, she said. This thing's been eating it up. We'll be lucky to have enough to get to shore when we see land. When will we get there? Ivan asked. He was bobbing in the water just ahead of Isabel, hanging on to the hull like she was. Tomorrow, hopefully, Senor Costello said from inside the boat. The same thing he'd said yesterday and the day before that. Mañana, Isabel's father whispered. He was treading water on the other side of the boat with Senor Costello, his head just visible over the side. He'd been whispering that word off and on since yesterday, and it seemed shaken up somehow. Isabel didn't know why. We'll see the lights of Miami sometime tomorrow, and we'll head straight for it, Mommy said. She shifted and winced uncomfortably. What is it? Are you all right? Papi asked. Isabel's mother put another hand on her belly. I think it's begun. What's begun? Papi asked. His eyes went wide. You mean the baby's coming? Here? Now? Everyone in the boat perked up. Isabel and Ivan pulled themselves up on the side of the boat to see. Isabel was a jumble of emotions. She was excited to see her brother born after waiting so long, but suddenly she was also afraid. Afraid for her mother to have the baby here on this fragile raft in the middle of the ocean, and worried, too, for the first time about how her baby brother would change her fragile family. Yes, I think I've gone into labor, Isabel's mother said calmly. But no, I'm not having this baby here and now. The contractions are just starting. It took Isabel another 10 hours to come after my contractions began, remember? Isabel had never heard her mother talk about her birth before, and she was curious and just a little weirded out at the same time. What are you going to name him? Ivan asked. Mommy and Pappy looked at each other. We haven't decided yet. Well, I have some ideas if you want some, Ivan said. Flares, Isabel told him, and Ivan stuck his tongue out at her. They were all quiet for a time. Isabel watched as the golden horizon shifted from orange to purple to deep blue. Would her baby brother be born at sea or in the United States? Would the end of their song really be a new life in Miami? Or would it end in tragedy for all of them, adrift, out of gas, dying of thirst in the great saltwater desert of the Atlantic? Hey, we never named our boat, Ivan said. Everyone moaned and laughed. What? Ivan said, smiling. Every good boat needs a name. I think we can all agree that this isn't really a good boat, Senor Castillo said. But it's the boat that's taking us to the States, to freedom, Ivan said. It deserves a name. What about Fidel? Luis joked, kicking up a splash on Castro's face at the bottom of the boat. No, Pappy said. El Etude Flotante, the floating coffin. Isabel winced at the name. It wasn't funny. Not with her mother about to have a baby in the boat. Too close, Senor Castillo agreed. How about Mi Puro, he suggested. It was slang for I'm out of here in Cuba. How, Pisco? Mommy said, and everyone laughed. It literally meant goodbye, fish, but everyone in Cuba said it to each other to say goodbye. St. Louis, Isabel's grandfather said softly. Everyone was quiet for a moment, trying to figure out the joke, but no one noticed. How about El Camilo? Louis said. The camel was what they called the ugly humpback buses that were pulled around by tractors in Havana. No, I've got it, Amara said. El Bortero. It was perfect because it was the slang word for the taxis in Havana, but it really meant the boatman. All the adults laughed and clapped. No, Ivan said, frustrated. It needs to be a cool-sounding name, like the... Ivan jumped a little in the water and his eyes went wide. The what? Isabel said. Then she jumped too as something hard and leathery bumped into her leg. Shark! screamed Isabel's grandfather from the other side of the boat. Shark! The water around Ivan became a dark red cloud, and Isabel screamed. Something bumped into her again, and Isabel scrambled to climb into the boat, arms and legs shaking, panic thundering in her chest. Her father grabbed her around the middle, and they fell back to tumble inside the boat. Beside them, Amara and Mommy pulled Senora Castillo into the boat as Lito pushed her up out of the water from behind. Isabel and her father scrambled to their knees and pulled her grandfather behind her. On the other side of the boat, Luis and Senor Castillo cried out Ivan's name as they hauled his limp body over the side. Ivan's right leg was a bloody mess. There were small bites all over it, as though a gang of sharks had attacked all at once. Raw, red, gaping wounds exposed the muscle underneath his skin. Isabel fell back against the side of the boat in horror. She'd never seen anything so awful. She felt like she was going to throw up. Senor Castillo wailed. Ivan was so shocked he didn't even cry out, didn't speak. His eyes had a glazed look to them, and his mouth hung open. One of the gashes up near his thigh was still pumping blood like a garden hose, and Isabel watched as Ivan's face grew pale. She couldn't speak. A tourniquet, Luis cried. We have to get something around his leg to stop the bleeding. Isabel's father yanked off his belt, and Lito tied it as high around Ivan's leg as he could. The blood still flowed, coloring the water all around them in the boat, a dark, sickening red. No, Senor Castillo cried as the life went out of Ivan's eyes. Isabel wanted to scream too, but she was frozen. There was nothing she could do. There was nothing any of them could do. Ivan was dead. Luis yelled in rage and pulled his police pistol from its holder. Bang, bang! He fired once, twice, 3 times at the fin that circled the boat. No, Lito said, grabbing Luis's hand before he could shoot again. You'll just bring more sharks with the blood in the water. Too late. Another fin appeared, and soon the nameless little boat was surrounded. They were trapped in their own sinking prison. Now on to Mahmoud. He is 12 days from home in Lesbos, Greece. This says Lesbos, Greece to Athens, 2015. So he and his mom were finally rescued by a boat that had his father and Boeed in them. They got to shore, but there's no sign of Hannah, his little sister. Mahmoud was in a tent city. The paved parking lot at the pier of Lesbos was full of the kinds of camping tents sold in sporting goods stores. Round-top single-family tents of blue and green and white and yellow and red, all provided by Greek relief workers who knew the refugees had nowhere to stay while they waited for the ferry to Athens to come. Wet clothes were hung to dry on bicycle racks and traffic signs, and refugees gathered around the camp stoves and hot plates. It should have been a lively place, full of songs and laughter, like the Kilos refugee camp. But instead, a soft, mournful murmur of conversation hung over the tent city like a fog. Mahmoud wasn't surprised. His family felt exactly the same way. They all should have been excited to finally be increased, to be allowed to buy real tickets to travel on an actual ferry to mainland Europe. But too many of them had lost someone in the sea crossing to be happy. Mahmoud's mother had gone from tent to tent, asking after Hannah. Mahmoud had helped. It was his fault she was gone after all. But no one at the dock had her. No one had been on the dinghy that had taken her. Refugees came and went, but the tents remained. Mahmoud's mother insisted they miss the next ferry to Athens, so she could ask each new round of refugees for word of her daughter. But no one knew anything about her. Mahmoud felt as sick as he had on the dinghy. He couldn't look at his mother. She had to blame him for losing Hannah. He certainly blamed himself. He couldn't sleep at night. He kept picturing his sister's dinghy bursting on the rocks, Hannah falling into the water, none of them there to help her. Mahmoud's mother wanted to stay at the dock longer and didn't want to leave without knowing what happened to Hannah. But Dad told her they had to move on. There was no telling when the ferry line might suddenly decide to stop selling tickets to refugees, or when Greece might decide to send them all home. They had to keep moving, or they would die. Hannah had to have gone ahead of them on the morning ferry they'd missed the first day, or else. No one wanted to think about the or else. The huge Athens ferry arrived again in that morning. It was the length of a soccer field and at least 5 stories tall. The bottom half of it was painted blue, and Blue Star Ferries was written in big words on the side. A radar bar spun near the bridge, and antennas and satellite dishes sprouted from the roof. It looked like the pictures Mahmoud had seen of cruise ships. His lifeboats alone were bigger than the dinghy they had left Turkey in. Mahmoud tried to get Walid interested in the big ship to get him excited about their first trip on a boat that big, but his little brother didn't care. He didn't seem to care about anything. A big ramp on the back lowered, and refugees streamed on board the ferry. Mahmoud's mother wept as they climbed a ramp with the other passengers. She kept looking back over her shoulder at the tent city, hoping Mahmoud was sure to catch a glimpse of someone carrying a baby who might be Hannah. She never did. Inside of the ferry was like a lobby of a fancy hotel. Every floor had little clusters of glass tables and white upholstered chairs. Snack bars sold chips and sweets and sodas, and televisions played a Greek soccer game. Refugees who still had belongings stuffed their backpacks and trash bags under tables and into overhead compartments. Mahmoud and his family settled into one of the booths, and his father searched for a plug to charge the phone. Mahmoud, why don't you take your brother and explore the ship? Dad told him. Mahmoud was only too glad to get away from the sight of his mother's broken face, and he took Walid by the hand and pulled him out onto the promenade that ran around the outside of the ship. Mahmoud and Walid watched silently as the ferry pulled away from the dock, the ship's huge engines thrumming deep below them. The awful sea that had tried to swallow them was calm and sapphire blue now. The Greek island of Lesbos was actually beautiful when you saw it from the sea. Little white buildings with terracotta roofs rose up tree-covered hills, and on the bottom one of the hills was an ancient gray castle. Mahmoud could see why people visited here on vacation. Besides the refugees, there were a number of tourists on board. Mahmoud could tell they weren't refugees because they wore clean clothes and used their phones for taking pictures instead of looking up overland routes from Athens to Macedonia. Another refugee had laid out a map on the deck, and he was praying. In all the bustle of waiting in line and getting on board, Mahmoud had lost track of what time it was, and he pulled his brother down to pray with him alongside the man. As he knelt and stood, Mahmoud was supposed to be focused only on his prayers, but he couldn't help notice the uneasy looks the tourists gave him. Frowns of displeasure, like Mahmoud and his brother and this man were doing something wrong. The vacationers dropped their voices, even though Mahmoud couldn't understand what they were saying, and he could hear disgust in their words. It wasn't what the tourists had paid for. They were supposed to be on a holiday, seeing ancient ruins and beautiful Greek beaches, not stepping over filthy, praying refugees. They only see us when we do something they don't want us to do, Mahmoud realized. The thought hit him like a lightning bolt. When they stayed where they were supposed to, in the ruins of Aleppo or behind the fences of a refugee camp, people could forget about them. But when refugees did something they didn't want them to do, when they tried to cross the border into their country, or sleep on the front stoops of their shops, or jump in front of their cars, or pray on the decks of their ferries, that's when people couldn't ignore them any longer. Mahmoud's first instinct was to disappear below decks, to be invisible. Being invisible in Syria had kept him alive. But now Mahmoud began to wonder if being invisible in Europe might be the death of him and his family. If no one saw them, no one could help them. Maybe the world needed to see what was really happening here. It was hard not to see the refugees in Athens when Mahmoud got there. Syrians were everywhere in the streets, hotels, markets, most of them, like Mahmoud's family, planning to move on as soon as they could. Mahmoud's father thought he had the right documents to travel freely in Greece, but a woman at the immigration office told him he would need to go to a local police station first to get an official document. And the police told him he would have to wait up to a week. We can't wait a week, Mahmoud's father told his family. They found a hotel for 10 euros a night per person, and the people of Athens were very friendly and helpful. Mahmoud knew his parents only had so much money. They still had 4 more countries to cross before they reached Germany. Mahmoud's mother would have stayed a week or even longer to keep asking everyone she met if they had seen a baby named Hana, but it was decided they would take the train to the border of Macedonia and try to sneak across during the night. End of part 12.